She was 34 years old, and by the first frost of 1889, she had nothing left in the world but a name that no longer opened doors. That name was Marrow, and it had once meant something in Coldwater Hollow, Colorado, until her husband Daniel was buried under 200 tons of shale in the Hollow Ridge mine, and his brother Thomas decided that a widow's grief was a debt to be collected rather than a grief to be honored. Thomas Marrow, who had signed papers their father had never truly explained to her, declared the cabin and the 5 acres around his by right of inheritance, and had her belongings set out on the frozen road before the week was through. She left with $14 sewn into the hem of her coat, a tin of her mother's needles, and a grief so large it had no edges. With that $14, she did something the whole town called foolish. She walked 11 miles up the mountain road and bought, for $9 at a sheriff sale nobody else wanted to attend, the old abandoned line shack known as the Tanner Cabin, a place with a cave porch and a reputation for knocking sounds that had sent 2 families running down the mountain in the night. Everyone said she had paid $9 for a haunted ruin and called a bargain. They did not know that beneath its floorboards was a secret that would take nearly 2 years to fully surface, a secret that would not only change the rest of her life, but would return to an entire grieving town, something it believed had been lost forever under that mountain. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Mara Marrow. If you have ever stood somewhere so forgotten that even the wind seemed to pass it by without slowing down, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Mara had not always been a Marrow, and she had not always been someone the town looked past. She was born Mara Whitfield in a river valley 2 counties east, the third of 5 daughters to a blacksmith who believed, unusually for his time, that a girl's hands were as capable of a trade as any son's. He taught her to read a ledger before she was 10, to reckon board feet and nail weights, to listen to the particular silence a building makes right before something in it gives way. Her mother, meanwhile, taught her the quieter arts, how to make a single potato stretch across 3 meals, how to mend a coat so the mend didn't show, how to sit with a frightened animal until it trusted your hand. It was, her mother always said, the same skill either way. Patience was something that could not yet show you what it was worth. Mara carried both of those inheritances west when, at 22, she married Daniel Marrow, a quiet, broad-shouldered timberman who had come through her valley buying lumber for a mining outfit in the Colorado high country, and who had looked at her not the way other men did, sizing up a face, but the way her father looked at a beam before he trusted it to hold a roof, carefully, and with real respect for what he could not yet see all the way through. They settled in Coldwater Hollow, a mining town pressed into a fold of the Rockies where the Hollow Ridge mine employed nearly every able body and widowed nearly as many, though no one liked to say that second part aloud. Daniel worked as a timberman inside the mine itself, shoring up the tunnels with the same care he'd once brought to choosing lumber, and Mara kept their cabin at the base of the ridge road, took in mending from half the town, and nursed the sick when the doctor's rounds ran thin, because her mother's patience had become, in her, something the whole valley eventually leaned on. She was known, not admired exactly, not yet, but known, as the woman who could fix a thing others had given up on, whether it was a torn coat, a fevered child, or a hen that wouldn't lay. Daniel's father, Elias Marrow, an old widower himself and a foreman at the mine for 20 years, took to Mara almost immediately, in the particular way of a man who has lost his own wife and finds, in his son's choice, someone who reminds him what steadiness looks like. Elias would come by on Sunday evenings with a jar of his own preserves, terrible preserves, always too much clove, and sit by their stove telling stories about the mine's early days, about the men who died opening the first shafts, about a second, older tunnel system beneath the newer one that the company had sealed off years back because it ran too close to an underground spring and was, in his words, a mouth better left shut. It was Elias who first told her, half joking, that the mountain remembered everything that happened inside it, the good and the ill both, and that someday the mountain would settle its own accounts, with or without anyone's help. Mara had laughed at the time. She did not know then how literally she would come to take those words. Daniel and Mara had no children, a private sorrow between them that they carried quietly and without blame, and in its place they built a marriage of unusual closeness. Long evenings of reading aloud by lamplight, Daniel teaching her the names of the rock strata he worked through each day, Mara teaching him embroidery stitches he was hopeless at and loved anyway. She learned, in those 6 years, to love not just the man but the mountain itself, its brutal winters and sudden green summers, the way morning fog pooled in the hollow like something poured from a jug. She learned to love the particular community of women who kept that town alive in the spaces between the mine's demands. Women who sat vigil together, who split what little they had further still when a family needed it more, who understood, without ever quite saying it, that they were all one bad shift away from the same grief. It was this town, these women, this particular fierce, unspoken sisterhood of the hollow, that Mara would later find herself fighting to save, long after she had stopped believing anyone in Coldwater Hollow owed her anything at all. The collapse came in the spring of 1888 in the newer eastern gallery of the Hollow Ridge mine, and it took Daniel along with 4 other men, including 2 of the timber crew who had voiced concerns weeks earlier about shoring that had been approved too fast and inspected too little. Elias Marrow was not in that gallery that day. He had been reassigned, oddly, just 2 days prior, to oversee surface operations, a reassignment he would later come to see as either mercy or warning. He was never sure which. In the terrible days after, as 5 widows in Coldwater Hollow buried what could be recovered and grieved what could not, the mine's owner, a smooth, unhurried man named Silas Croft, who had bought controlling interest in the Hollow Ridge only 2 years before, expressed his condolences in the town paper and quietly closed the Eastern Gallery pending review, a review that somehow never concluded and was never published. Mara noticed, in her grief, that Elias Marrow had gone strange and silent, that he flinched at questions about the shoring reports, that he stopped coming by on Sundays at all. She had no room, then, to wonder why. Grief was its own mountain, and she was still climbing out from under it. It was in that raw season that Thomas Marrow, Daniel's younger brother, a man who had spent most of his adult life 2 towns over trying and failing at various ventures, returned to Coldwater Hollow with papers he said their late father had drawn up years before, granting him, not Daniel, ultimate claim to the family cabin and land in the event of Daniel's death without a male heir. Mara did not fully believe the papers were legitimate. The signature looked wrong to her, the ink too fresh for the date claimed, but she had no money for a lawyer, no standing in a courthouse that rarely sided with widows over living male kin, and no strength left to fight a battle on top of the one grief had already handed her. Thomas, for his part, showed no real cruelty in his manner, only a kind of hollow, apologetic greed, the manner of a man convincing himself he deserved what he was taking. He gave her 3 days to gather her things. She took her mother's needles, Daniel's reading glasses, 6 books, and the $14 that remained from what she and Daniel had managed to save, and she walked out of the only home she had known as a wife, down the frozen road, toward a future she could not yet see the shape of. She did not go far, and this, more than anything else, was what the town would later remember about her. That instead of leaving the hollow entirely, as any sensible person would have, Mara Marrow walked further up the mountain instead of down it. At the sheriff's sale that Thursday, held in the back room of the assay office to auction off 3 properties seized for unpaid taxes, she bid on the Tanner cabin, a half-collapsed line shack a mile above the town that had sat empty for 6 years, ever since old Silas Tanner died and his sons, spooked by stories of knocking in the walls, refused to winter there even once. The auctioneer took her $9 with visible reluctance, as though selling it to a widow with nowhere else to go felt uncomfortably close to selling her the rope with which to hang herself. Mrs. Alma Pfeiffer, who ran the boarding house and had a soft spot for Mara, pulled her aside afterward and told her plainly that no family had lasted a full season in that cabin since the elder Tanner died, that something in the walls or under the floor knocked at night, slow and patient, like knuckles on a door that was never opened, and that a wiser woman would take her $9 worth of goodwill and go stay with cousins in Denver instead. Mara only thanked her for the warning and walked the mile up the ridge road with what she owned in a single canvas sack, because a knocking in an empty house frightened her a good deal less, that season, than the certainty of having nowhere at all to lay her head. The cabin, when she reached it, was worse than she'd braced for, and somehow also, in a way she could not explain, exactly what she needed. A single room with a stone hearth gone half to rubble, a roof patched more with hope than shingle, and floorboards silvered with age that groaned under her boots like something waking from long sleep. She spent her first days simply making it livable, the way her mother had taught her to make anything livable. Patch what you can, accept what you cannot, and never let the cold find every gap at once. She caulked the worst of the wall seams with clay and dried moss, traded mending work down in the hollow for a stovepipe and 2 blankets, and told herself, each night as she banked a fire, that a haunted cabin was still a roof, and a roof in October in the Rockies was worth more than any ghost story. The knocking began on her 4th night, and it was, she would later admit, unlike anything a wind or a settling timber could produce. 3 slow raps, a pause exactly as long as a held breath, then 3 more, coming unmistakably from beneath the floor rather than from any wall or window. She sat bolt upright in the dark with her heart going like a rabbit's, and for one long, cold minute she considered, seriously, walking back down the mountain in her nightclothes rather than spend one more hour above whatever was making that sound. But her father's voice came to her, unbidden, the way it always did in moments of fear. Listen to the silence right before something gives way. And she made herself notice that this was not the silence of collapse. It was patient. It was almost polite. Whatever knocked beneath her floor was not trying to bring the cabin down around her. It seemed to her, trying to be heard. She did not sleep again that night. And by lamplight she began, with a fire iron in her bare, trembling hands, to examine the floorboards nearest the hearth, where the sound had seemed loudest. It took her the better part of an hour to notice that one board, unlike its neighbors, had been cut cleanly rather than split, and fitted with 2 iron pins rather than nailed flush the way the rest of the floor had been laid. When she worked the pins loose and lifted the board, she found not the crawl space of dirt and stone she expected, but a narrow wooden hatch beneath it, and beneath that hatch, a black square of nothing that breathed cold air up in her face like the mouth of a cave. She held her lamp down into it and saw the top rungs of a ladder, hewn rough but sturdy, descending in a dark she could not see the bottom of, and carve into the header beam above the hatch, in letters gone soft with age, a single word, safe. She did not go down that first night. She sat instead at the edge of that black square hole with her lamp burning low beside her, and she thought of every story she had ever heard about mountain men and forgotten mine shafts and the dangers of chasing a sound into the dark. And she thought, too, about the particular patience of that knocking, 3 raps and a pause, 3 raps and a pause, a rhythm too deliberate to belong to wind or water or a settling house. In the morning she went down to the hollow and, without quite saying why, asked old Mrs. Pfeiffer whether Silas Tanner had ever kept a root cellar, and Mrs. Pfeiffer said no. Not that anyone knew, though she recalled Tanner had once worked the eastern seam of the Hollow Ridge mine himself, back before the newer gallery opened, back when the old check tunnels still connected the mountainside to the mine proper before the company sealed them for safety. That night Mara went back up the mountain with candles, a coil of rope, and a resolve she did not entirely trust, and she went down the ladder. The passage beneath the cabin was hand-dug, narrow enough that her shoulders brushed both walls, and it ran, by her reckoning, some 60 or 70 feet before opening into a chamber just tall enough to stand in, shored with old timber in a style she recognized instantly, because she had watched Daniel build shoring exactly like it 100 times over 6 years of marriage. In that chamber she found a cot, a stove no larger than a bread box, 3 crates of tinned goods and dried meat, a water barrel fed by a trickle of spring water down one wall, and laid across the cot with careful hands, a coat she knew. It was Elias Marrow's coat, the same brown wool coat he had worn every Sunday evening he'd sat by their stove telling stories, and beside it, propped against the wall with the deliberate patience of a man arranging his own resting place, sat Elias Marrow himself, thinner than she remembered, bearded past recognition, blinking against her lamplight like something long and used to daylight, alive, and weeping before she could even find words to ask him how. He told her everything that night, in a voice gone rusty from disuse, the words coming slow at first, and then in a flood he seemed almost relieved to finally release. He told her that he had not been reassigned from the Eastern Gallery by chance 2 days before the collapse. He had been moved, quietly, by Silas Croft himself, after Elias raised written objection to shoring timber that had been substituted, without proper inspection, for a cheaper grade that saved the company nearly a third on cost. He told her he had kept a copy of that objection, and a second set of inspection figures the foreman above him had falsified at Croft's direction, hidden in an oilcloth-wrapped package he'd carried in his coat that very day, meaning to take it to the circuit judge in the county seat. He told her that after the collapse, grief-mad and terrified, he had understood with sudden, cold clarity that a man who would falsify safety records to save money would not hesitate to bury an inconvenient witness along with the evidence. And so, rather than go to the authorities as a broken, unsupported old man against a rich man's word, he had done the only thing his mining instincts told him might keep him alive. He had vanished into the old check tunnels. He alone still remembered the layout of tunnels that ran, as it happened, directly beneath the abandoned Tanner cabin where Silas Tanner himself, decades before, had dug this very shelter as an escape route from an earlier, smaller collapse. Elias had survived nearly a year and a half down there, venturing out only at deepest night to refill his water and check, always, whether anyone had moved into the cabin above him. And when Mara herself had moved in, he had been too afraid to reveal himself outright, too uncertain whether she could be trusted or whether word might reach Croft before he could finish deciding. And so he had done the only thing that felt safe. He had knocked, 3 slow raps and a pause, hoping that whoever lived above him might be patient enough and kind enough to listen rather than run. Mara sat with him in that stone chamber until the candle guttered low, holding the oilcloth package he finally placed in her hands, and she understood, turning those brittle, damning pages over in the dim light, that she was holding not merely the truth of her husband's death, but a debt owed to 5 widows in Coldwater Hollow who believed, as she once had, that the mountain had simply taken their husbands the way mountains sometimes did, rather than that a man in a clean office had chosen cheaper timber over their lives and then paid to keep that choice quiet. The days that followed tested her more than the discovery itself had. She could not simply march into town waving Elias's papers, not with Silas Croft's influence stretching over the assay office, the circuit judge's schedule, and half the merchants who depended on Hollow Ridge wages to keep their shelves stocked, and not with Thomas Marrow. She now understood with a sick, sliding feeling, having very likely known more than he let on. Given how conveniently his claim on the family land had followed so close on his brother's death, land that sat, as she now realized, directly above the very tunnels Silas Croft would want kept forever sealed and forgotten. She spent a careful week gathering allies rather than confrontations, starting with Alma Pfeiffer, whose boarding house saw every traveler through the county, and whose discretion Mara trusted the way her mother had once trusted a particular hen to sit faithfully on eggs. Together, quietly, they identified a newspaperman in the county seat who had once run a piece critical of company safety practices before advertisers pressured his editor into silence. And they began, letter by careful letter, to build a case that could not simply be bought or buried the moment it surfaced. Word reached Silas Croft before Mara was fully ready, as word in a small mountain town always eventually does, and he came to the Tanner cabin himself on a gray afternoon in early November, arriving on a fine horse with 2 company men flanking him, his manner as smooth and unhurried as ever, though Mara noted the particular tightness around his eyes of a man doing arithmetic he did not like the sum of. He offered her, without ever quite naming what he was buying her silence about, a sum of money that would have solved every practical problem she had, enough to buy back the Marrow cabin from Thomas outright, enough to see her comfortably settled anywhere she chose for the rest of her days, provided she abandoned whatever foolish tales that old ruin up here has put into your head. Mara, standing in her own doorway with her father's steadiness borrowed into her spine, told him only that she would think on his offer, and watched something flicker behind his composed face that told her he had expected either tears or immediate agreement, and had not accounted for a woman who simply quietly, declined to be afraid of him. Thomas Marrow came separately, 2 days later, arriving on foot and considerably less composed. And it was in that conversation that Mara finally understood the full, sad shape of what had happened. That Thomas had not forged those inheritance papers out of pure greed alone, but at Croft's quiet suggestion and with Croft's quiet money, because a compliant brother-in-law holding the Marrow land was far safer for Croft than an unpredictable widow who might one day go digging, literally or otherwise, into what lay beneath it. Thomas wept when he said this. Real tears, the tears of a weak man who has done a cruel thing for reasons that felt, at the time, almost survivable, and Mara found, to her own surprise, that she believed him more than she believed Croft, and pitied him more than she hated him, though she did not yet forgive him, and told him so plainly. The reckoning, when it came, was not the dramatic courtroom spectacle the town might have imagined, but something steadier and, in its way, more fitting to the mountain itself. Mara brought Elias Marrow down from the ridge under cover of a snowy dawn, wrapped in blankets and leaning on her arm like a man reborn into a world grown strange and bright around him. And together, with Alma Pfeiffer and the county newspaperman as witnesses, they laid the falsified inspection figures and Elias's original objection before the circuit judge, alongside sworn testimony from 2 surviving miners who had long suspected the shoring but lacked proof or standing to say so aloud. Silas Croft's carefully built respectability did not survive contact with a genuine paper trail and a living witness the whole town had assumed dead and mourned. Within the month, the company's charter was suspended pending state investigation, its assets frozen, and a fund established from those assets, at the judge's insistence, for every widow and orphan the Hollow Ridge Mine's shortcuts had made. Thomas Marrow, faced with his own complicity, surrendered his false claim on the family cabin without a fight, and though the town never fully restored its trust in him, he spent the following years working quietly, unglamorously, alongside the Miners' Relief Fund he had once helped rob. A slow penance Mara neither demanded nor forgave outright, but allowed, the way her mother had taught her, to allow a mended coat to prove itself over time. What mattered most to Mara, in the end, was not Croft's disgrace nor Thomas's slow penance, but what became of the relief fund itself, and of the mountain that had held its secret so long. She used none of the settlement for herself beyond what was owed her as Daniel's widow, and instead spent that first spring helping Alma Pfeiffer and the other Hollow widows organize the fund into something lasting, a proper relief society with its own modest building near the assay office, staffed by the very women who had once sat vigil together in grief, now sitting together instead in quiet. Capable stewardship of widows and children a mountain had made, and nearly forgotten. Elias Marrow, restored to a town that had mourned him and now marveled at him in equal measure, spent his remaining years teaching the newer timber crews the old, careful shoring methods he'd learned as a young man, refusing ever again to let cost be weighed against a miner's life while he had breath to object. In the Tanner cabin, the cabin $9 had bought and everyone in town had called a foolish, haunted ruin, became, in time, something the whole Hollow spoke of differently, a place where a woman with nothing had listened, patiently, to a knocking most people would have fled from, and had found beneath it not a haunting, but a truth waiting all along to be heard. It is worth remembering, now, exactly where this story began, with a widow of 34, cast out with $14 and a name too poor to protect her, buying for $9 a wrecked cabin nobody else would touch, because it was the only roof left to her in all the world. What made the difference, in the end, was never the $9, nor even the secret waiting beneath the floor. What made the difference was that Mara Marrow had been raised to believe that value is not always visible on the surface of a thing. Not in a torn coat, not in a fevered child, not in an old ruin with a bad reputation. And that patience, real patience, the kind her mother had taught her over a stubborn hen and a mended sleeve, is simply the willingness to sit with something long enough for its worth to finally show itself. She had sat with that knocking instead of running from it, and in doing so, she had given an entire grieving town back a truth, a witness, and a future it had believed the mountain had swallowed for good. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Maramero tonight. If her story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things and overlooked people often hold more worth in the world first give them credit for. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. What is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing where in the world this story found you tonight. Until next time, stay close.